Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We on Harvard believe that war, although sometimes necessary, should only be undertaken when absolutely necessary. And that when it's done, that it must be done in the most just way possible that limits unnecessary deaths and civilian casualties. As a consequence, we believe that since the motion before this House is that this House believes that the media should show the full horrors of war, that we should run this in the broadest way possible to have the best possible debate on the merits. As a consequence, what we're going to say is that normatively, democratic states should not limit the content that their media show. We want to further clarify our model in 3 ways. First off, the government should not censor the media from presenting any images that do not have non-strategic value. Let me give you an example of this. When caskets returned to the United States from Afghanistan and Iraq, the Bush administration restricted the media from taking photos of those caskets. There's no strategic reason why this wasn't allowed, and consequently, government shouldn't be allowed to ban these kinds of images. However, Geraldo Rivera, during the invasion of Iraq, drew a map on the sand that showed troop movements. This is acceptable to ban because it doesn't show the horrors of war, but instead conveys strategic information. Secondly, we would say, is that the media should not self-censor from showing images because of the graphic or violent nature. What we'd say here as an example is things like the Daniel Pearl beheading, where the US media refused to show it because it showed a violent graphic beheading of a Wall Street Journal journalist. And we think that if the media were to show this, we'd understand the risk of journalists and other civilians within the conflicts of war. Third, what we'd say is that our model doesn't just contain graphic images, but as well information and documents that have non-strategic value. Let me give you another example based on the American recent conflicts, which is that both the Bush administration and now the Obama administration have been unwilling to release many important documents about our behavior in Guantanamo Bay and also within the conflict of Iraq and Afghanistan, even though they don't have strategic information within there, because we're afraid that they'll embolden the enemy. But what we're going to tell you is all of these images would be better out if they were in the public marketplace because it would lead to more just wars being fought. As a consequence, I have 3 constructive arguments I'd like to offer. No, thank you. First, we're going to say that this is going to reduce the rates of non-necessary wars being fought in the future. Secondly, we're going to say that when wars are fought, that they will be more just. And third, I'm going to argue that this will not hamper our ability to fight necessary conflicts, and that we'll still be able to do so, and we won't lose the resolve to fight these situations. First, why is this going to help eliminate the fighting of unnecessary war in the future? No, thank you. First off, we'd say that democracies, as we set our model, function based on informed citizens. However, there's a disconnect between our ability to process analytic facts and our ability to process images and graphic information. This is because when we see an image, we have a graphic and visceral reaction instead of simply an analytic reaction to seeing a big number like 50,000 dead in Vietnam. The consequence is just one image can create the reaction within citizens that they'll understand what's actually taking place within the theater, and instead change their opinions about the costs of war and be more critical in the future. We think, however, when the images like CNN is afraid to show anything too graphic, people don't understand how bloody and violent it really is in Iraq right now, and as a consequence, don't really think critically about how long the United States should stay there or how we should conduct our policies there. No, thank you. As a consequence, we think this is incredibly problematic. However, we'd secondly say this would help to limit the number of volunteers in the future. Far too often in democratic countries, people just volunteer gung-ho to go off into the war zone or to join the military because they don't know what it's like to be a soldier. They have military recruiters telling them that they get to be G.I. Joe and jump out of helicopters without them ever seeing the images of what it's actually like to be in a conflict zone. Both their comrades die, but also that they'll be in situations where there's citizens, literally innocent civilians that are targeted as well, and that they'll have to deal with these images. We think that citizens will make more informed decisions about whether or not they want to go to war in the future. As a consequence, if there's lower numbers of volunteers in Western liberal states, the consequence is going to be huge that they're going to be less likely to go into conflicts willy-nilly. As a consequence, they'll have to think more critically about how to use troops and the most efficient way to expend them. The third argument we make, however, is that under this point, is that it emboldens members of the opposition. Right now in countries like the United States or other members that were part of the coalition, immediately after 9/11, it was very difficult to be critical of the war effort. However, if it was the case with normal citizens, we're seeing how violent the conflict was in Afghanistan, it would have been easier for opposition parties to step up and say, maybe we should think really hard about how we're fighting this war and not let the Bush administration spend 4 years before they get their act together. We think we'd be better off if opposition members can actually be critical in this way. Sure.
Here's not the obvious effect of your model, that the families of the 3 US contractors mutilated and hung from a bridge in Fallujah in 2004 would have their communities last see them hanging from a bridge, mutilated and burned.
Sure, I think there would be a lot of pain for those individual families, but the rest of us would share their pain, and as a consequence would be act in a more rational manner. But when we aren't sharing their pain, no reason for us to change our policies. And the result is more contractors are hung from bridges on your side of the house, which is exactly what we're trying to avoid. Finally, however, what we'd say is that academics and journalists will be able to be more critical about the revenues of the future. The second argument, however, I'd like to make is it leads to more just wars. Now, there's three principles of just war theory. That is proportionality, necessity, and discretion. We think that by showing images, you actually create sympathy for victims that make it more likely that all three of these principles will be followed. First off, proportionality. Now, Israel's actually been very good about only being proportionate when they're willing to bomb targets within Gaza because they know that the Israeli journalists are very good at showing images of civilian deaths. However, the United States at once killed 247 people trying to kill one al-Qaeda leader, many of them civilians, because they limited journalists' access to photos of this. As a result, Americans weren't so critical of the fact that we were willing to be unproportional in our war on terror. When these images get out there, people stop to say, really, is this one leader worth killing so many innocent people? Secondly, necessity has also helped. Think about Abu Ghraib, the photos that got out of Abu Ghraib of people being incredibly unhumane towards prisoners. Once these photos got out, Americans said, why are we doing this to prisoners? We need to investigate this. But it's only after the images come out. Third, we think there's better discretion. We think that actually what discretion means is just delineating between civilians and non-civilians. But only when you see images of civilians actually being targeted do we have an incentive to tell the military to use more strategic bombs, because in modern warfare there's continually incentives for the military to target to afar, which leads to non-discretion. Third, however, we don't think this will hamper our ability to fight conflicts in the future. First off, because countries will actually have to get more international support before they go into conflicts because their citizens won't want them to go into conflicts unnecessarily. We think this leads to more just wars and more better conflicts. Secondly, however, we think that images of humanitarian conflicts will actually embolden us to go into these conflicts. After Americans saw movies like Hotel Rwanda, we couldn't believe that we didn't go into the conflict. However, the media at the time self-censored the images they showed of people literally having limbs cut off. The consequence is that we were unwilling to go into these situations. Finally, however, we think that these images are the most powerful in many cases, like the bloody people being targeted in Iran, and will make us think critically about what conflicts are most important. As a consequence, we've tried to set up the broadest possible debate where we can discuss the issues and argue that this will limit unnecessary wars, that this will lead to more just wars, but we'll still be able to fight necessary wars. For all of these reasons, we are very proud to propose